98% nutrition retention in freeze-dried food. It's actually locking in the nutrition for extended periods of time. Because it's locking in that nutrition, what it's doing is it's locking in the flavor. You end up with a product that most of the time looks nearly identical to the fresh version of the food. It is very close, but it's not exact. But it's way closer than something like a dehydrated food, and definitely way closer than something like a canned food, right? Or anything that's been heated.
My name is Lisa, mother of 8 and creator of the blog and YouTube channel Farmhouse on Boone. On this podcast, I like to talk about simplifying your life so you can live out your priorities. I help you learn how to cook from scratch and decorate on a budget through this podcast and my courses, Simple Sourdough and the Simple Sewing series. I also help people reach their goals from home through my business courses, Create Your Blog Dream and YouTube Success Academy. I will leave links to these resources in the show notes and description box below. Now let's get into the show. Welcome back to the Simple Farmhouse Life podcast. Today, I'm having on Carolyn Thomas from Homesteading Family. If you are in the homesteading world or you like to watch things like that on YouTube or listen to podcasts, you've probably already heard of Carolyn and her husband, Josh. They also run the School of Traditional Skills, and I did a fermenting class on there. But we're going to chat today about freeze drying. And before you click away, you might think, oh, I already know. All you do is you cut stuff up, put it on the little freeze dryer and press the button. That's what I thought too. But there's actually a lot more to know about it. Or if you think, okay, this probably isn't worth it, there's probably not much that freeze drying has to offer me in my homestead. Carolyn actually thought the same thing when she first got into it, and she found herself very wrong. So there was a lot of things in this episode that I learned that I really honestly already thought that I knew. So it's a very valuable listen. Carolyn, thank you so much for coming on. We are going to talk about a topic that has been very close to you for several years, but even more so in this last year because you've written a book on freeze drying. So tell us a bit about yourself for those who don't know you and your new book.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's great to get to be here and get to hang out with you. So my name's Carolyn. I run Homesteading Family with my husband, Josh, and that's where we do a lot of education on homesteading topics. And one of the things that I really spend a lot of time on is food preservation. And part of that's because I'm up here in the very far north of Idaho. So we have a really short growing season, which means that if we want to eat our homegrown food year round, we're doing a lot of food preservation to make that actually stretch that whole amount of time. So years ago, when I first heard about freeze drying, I really thought it was a gimmick. I was totally skeptical. I was like, oh my goodness, it's just another thing that they want you to buy. It's just a marketing thing. It's a fad. It's going to go away in no time at all. You know, and here I am teaching all these traditional preservation skills. So to me, I was just like, you know, this isn't going to last. And that's what I thought, honestly, for quite a few years. I just really thought it was a fad. I thought, you know, we've been preserving food for thousands of years as a human.
Right.
Without an expensive gadget like this. And we've gotten along just fine. So I really didn't think that freeze drying was something that was going to be around for a while. So fast forward a few years and Harvest Right reached out to me and asked me to take a freeze dryer in exchange for doing some honest review videos. And I actually countered them. I was like, you know, I'm not going to be nice just because
this isn't me.
It's going to be a seriously honest review. And I honestly thought, Lisa, that this was my moment to tell everybody they didn't need a freeze dryer.
There are people that are still doing that, but yeah, they obviously Harvest Right was confident when they agreed to this.
They totally must have had a lot of confidence in their product because I straight out was telling them, like, I don't see this going the direction you want it to go. And they were like, okay, well, just try it. And I said, okay, well, if you're good with that, then, you know, then I will. And so I got it. And I had not really done a lot of research in it because honestly, I did not see myself using this as a preservation method. So when I got it, I did not even realize that I was going to need some special electrical setups in the house, which you do. If you get certain sizes machines, you need, certain dedicated circuits or different things based on the size of your machine. And so when we got it, we went to go set it up and we're like, okay, this is not something we're just going to plug in and push go. We actually need to call the electrician. And so by the time I got this machine set up, it was like January. And there is not a whole lot coming out of my North Idaho garden in January. And so I was like, what am I even going to do with this thing? But I had some onions that were getting soft. And so I said, okay, well, I'll just run some onions through it. And I ran those onions through. And for one, it was really easy. I had to give it that right off the bat. It was a couple pushes of a button. And I was like, okay, that was pretty straightforward, really simple. And then I got them into the kitchen though. And that's where I really started to get interested because they were so easy to use in the kitchen. I didn't even have to rehydrate the onions. They were already chopped. I just threw them into the pan and it was amazing. It was so great. But I really still was kind of had the skepticism of I'm holding on to my preformed judgment really hard. I can't believe that this thing's that handy. This must have just been really lucky. I got the one thing that was really easy to use.
Right. And, the best freeze dryer vegetable.
Yeah. I just stumbled on it. Right. And so the next thing that happened was we ended up with I can't remember. It was 80 to 100 laying hens that year that were all coming into their first lay right at the spring flush. And so we were, no joke, bringing in over 80 eggs every single day into the kitchen.
Which is, even for a large family, that's impossible to keep up with.
It really is. It's like, wow, I don't know that I thought through that side of this whole.
Yeah, I didn't think through for our number of chickens either. Yeah.
And so, I love water glassing. I love doing all these different things with eggs to preserve them, but there's only so many 5-gallon buckets of eggs that I can have laying around my basement. And so I thought, hey, the freeze dryer, let's try that. And I loved it. It was so fast. It was so easy. But the really cool thing is that nobody in the house could taste the difference between a freeze-dried egg that had been rehydrated and a fresh egg. And that to me was like gold. That was so amazing. So that's where I really started to go, okay, this is a thing. And then the raspberries hit. It got to be raspberry harvest season a couple months later. And I loved the raspberries so much that I started feeling a little bitter about having to make this decision of, do I put a batch of eggs in or do I put a batch of raspberries in? I didn't want to have to make the decision. I just wanted them both. So I actually turned around and I purchased a whole nother freeze dryer because I was like, I love this and it's giving me the best quality food on the other side. I just really like that. So now I've gone on and I've even purchased a third freeze dryer. It's just been something. I still can. I definitely still ferment. I still dehydrate. I use all of the methods, but I really find myself using that freeze dryer more and more.
Yeah. So first thing you did was onions.
Yeah.
What was your method of preserving an onion in the past? What would you have done?
Okay. So I always start with just cellaring them, right? Just curing them and letting them sit.
Yeah.
And a lot of years I can make that get me all the way through to the next onion season. Okay. But not all the time. So, even with a freeze dryer at my fingertips, I'm always going to opt towards the most practical option. Mm-hmm. And if it's putting them in a basket in my basement and that's all I have to do, then that's what I'm going to do. So that's usually what I do. But you experience this point some years where either they didn't cure great or something happened with the growing and they're not curing and storing as well, or just the basement's warmer. It's not as cold of a year. And so they're starting to sprout or they're starting to soften. Then usually what I'd be doing is, maybe canning them into a French onion soup, definitely doing some dehydrating, so those are kind of the go-to methods. Inevitably, I end up just losing a bunch of them because I just can't keep up with it.
Yeah. So a lot of those require more time, more space. You mentioned dehydrating. What's the difference there? I think a lot of people think that maybe they're very similar, freeze drying and dehydrating.
Yeah. Yeah. They do in some ways seem similar because you, for both of them, end up with a dry product. So in both ways, you're kind of dehydrating. But with a dehydrator, what you're usually doing is you're adding a little bit of heat and you're blowing air over something over a long period of time. And that is evaporating off the moisture. In a freeze dryer, what you're doing is you're freezing the food to a very low temperature, I think like -40 degrees. And then in that very frozen state, a vacuum pump kicks on, which is essentially decreasing the pressure inside. So you're getting an extremely low pressure environment. In fact, it's so low pressure, it's like being in outer space type of low pressure.
Wow.
And we know, if you've studied canning at all, those of you guys who are listening, you know that as you move up in altitude, the point of boiling decreases. Your temperature at boiling actually decreases. So what we're doing when we drop that pressure down that low is we're dropping the boiling point of the food to a place where it is going straight from frozen to evaporation. So you're missing the heat point altogether. You're never heating that food. What that does in freeze drying, and that's a process called sublimation. For those of you guys who are, aware of that scientific principle, what that means that it does is it is holding the cellular structure of the food almost completely intact, not 100%, but much more than if you're heating the food to evaporate off the moisture. So that means a couple things. One, it means that you super lock in the nutrition of the food. So that's why they're talking in a 98% nutrition retention in freeze-dried food. I actually dug into all the studies to see, are these just fancy marketing claims or is this for real? And it is for real. It's actually locking in the nutrition for extended periods of time, better than any other food preservation method that we have. Except maybe fermenting, which actually increases some of your vitamins for a short period.
But it's short term. So when you're looking for that long term, and it also requires more space.
Yes. Yeah, definitely requires more space. But it also, because it's locking in that nutrition, what it's doing is it's locking in the flavor, which, real flavor comes from real nutrition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're locking that in, that means you end up with a product that most of the time looks nearly identical to the fresh version of the food visually. So it doesn't shrink down like a dehydrated food. It keeps its bulk. It rehydrates to something that is much closer to the fresh version than a dehydrated food ever would, because those cellular walls are still intact. It just rehydrates in its original form, which is great. It's never going to be exactly like fresh.
Right.
Don't let anybody lie to you and say it's exactly the same. It is very close, but it's not exact. But it's way closer than something like a dehydrated food, and definitely way closer than something like a canned food or anything that's been heated. But yeah, so that probably represents the biggest differences between dehydrating and freeze drying is just that the way that cellular structure stays intact.
Yeah. So the advantage is obviously you're getting the nutrition, the freshness with it tasting almost the same. And then the storage aspect. So you were saying before when you would bring in 80 eggs a day or whatever, you would have to do water glassing, which is great. It's very simple. It's very easy, effective method. But all the eggs, they stay in their full egg form with the shell. They can break. With freeze drying, I think I pack like maybe 4 dozen eggs into a half-gallon jar, something like that. Am I remembering that right? I haven't done it this year.
When you're freeze drying or when you're water glassing?
Freeze drying.
When you're freeze drying.
Yeah. Right?
It's
or how
lot.
many are you fitting in a half-gallon jar?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's about an egg turns into about 2 tablespoons of powder. And so, you start doing that math and what that's like 8 tablespoons or 8 eggs per
you're just cracking them in and putting them on the freeze dryer. I think it was something like that. Whereas like with a water glassing, I think a half-gallon jar Well, so it must hold way more than that because it ends up taking up just way, way less space. So that seems like a really big advantage. I mean, for most people, having storage space is a problem for preserving.
Yeah, it really is. And the other thing with that is that, when you have these buckets of water glassed eggs or limed eggs, either of those, and you want to move them, it's a problem. You're either going to break them, which happens often and causes all sorts of problems with those, or they're just so heavy, you can't move them around.
Yeah.
When you go pick up a jar of freeze-dried eggs or even a bucket of freeze-dried eggs, they're very light because all of the moisture is out of them. So it really gives you a lot of storage flexibility when, freeze drying does in general, but definitely with the eggs, it gives you a lot of flexibility. Now, I've got to say, I lost about 50% of the eggs that I freeze dried that first run, first couple runs of eggs, because like I said, I hadn't really done a lot of research, and it's hard to find good information on freeze drying. It's actually frustrating.
It's still very new for the home, gardener, and
it really
homesteader.
is. And, most of the information that you can find is in these freeze drying Facebook groups. I have no idea what it is about people who freeze dry and people who are on Facebook and like the cross section of the two, but they're not nice. They're actually really mean.
That's just Facebook in general. Okay. There's also I heard it called like a gatekeeper, where like people who are into a certain thing, almost like you can't join us here. And so we're going to share we know and you can't anyways. Yeah. It's not a nice place.
It is not a nice place. And honestly, I was like, I would end up in tears over trying to, I don't know. I guess I'm pretty sensitive. I don't like people being mean to each other. I hate you can be mean to me, but I hate watching somebody else get attacked. And people were asking these very innocent questions of how do I do this? And they were getting attacked. So anyways, it was hard to even want to do the research into finding out the right way to do it. And what I found out is I was not sufficiently making sure that my eggs were completely dry, and I wasn't packaging them correctly. And so, for me, that was a lot of eggs before I think I had 200 quart jars of egg powder. And as I started going through them, I was maybe a third of them were bad. And that
were they moldy or were they smelling rotten, or what was the deal?
In that they didn't have enough moisture to mold in them, but they had gotten enough moisture for the bacteria to kick back in and, for them to start aging.
I think that's happened to me before. And I just assumed that so we had one time we did a big bulk freeze drying egg day. And we had lots of eggs that we didn't label properly. And so we were kind of just smelling each one individually, like you do. And unless you're more organized than me, in which case you don't. But, sometimes the kids will find a pile in the barn and it's well, we got to check these. But I think I just assumed that maybe one or two bad ones got in but maybe that's not what it was.
Right. Yeah. There is skill in freeze drying as much as it's hey, just push a button. It's easy. It's simple and easy, but you do have to have some skills. And where that really comes in is I feel like there's 3 places where you really have to know what you're doing when it's freeze drying. One is knowing how to pre-treat food. Because there are foods that really need to be pre-treated in order for them to turn out great, or in order for them to rehydrate great. Pre-treatment with freeze drying is always optional if you're okay with subpar food. So in that way, it's not optional, because it's if you want good food at the end, then you really want to pre-treat it. But some foods need certain pre-treatments, and it's different for each type of food. Just kind of like anything, even if you're freezing food, you're going to run into that. What needs a acid bath versus what needs to be blanched? It's all the same sort of a thing.
Okay.
But the other parts of the skills are, you've got to know how to test that your food is 100% done. And there are some tricks in that, especially when it comes to anything that has seeds in it, or that has thick skins. That can be really challenging for people. The other thing is you have to know how to store it properly. Otherwise, it will it'll just sit on the shelf and get ruined, which is, so the opposite of what we're trying to do. I know I can't stand it. And I can't stand it when I have to tell people So yeah, you really better throw out that food that you worked so hard on and spent money on, or, grew yourself. That's an awful feeling. But the good news is you can bypass all of that disappointment by just kind of gathering those different skills in those places. And then freeze drying becomes your best friend.
When Luke and I were first married 17 years ago, we were on a super tight budget, and the only way that I could decorate my home and make it my own cozy space was by doing a lot of DIY and sewing. I've shared that for years on my YouTube channel, on this podcast, on my blog, and recently I put all of those resources together, all of the patterns, the tutorials, and then step-by-step instructions from getting a machine and threading it, learning about tension issues and the bobbin, all those things maybe over the years that have scared you away from sewing, into one course that I've called the Simple Sewing Series. If you've wanted to sew but have been intimidated by the process of getting started, or even if you're a more seasoned seamstress or sewist and you want to improve your skills, I really think that this will be a great resource for you. There's also a private community associated with it, so if you have sewing questions or you're excited to meet other people who are also getting started on their sewing journey, that's available with the course as well, and it's for a very affordable price. You can find my new course and all of the resources that go along with it over at bit.ly/simple sewing course. That's bit.ly/simple sewing course, all lowercase. That's where you can find more info and become a student. Okay, so with eggs, how do you know for sure? Because what I found is whenever I'd get them out, then they would be like really cold if I left it, if I didn't get it out right away. Or yeah, and then sometimes I think like it condensates a little bit. Is that what happens? Or how do you make sure they're completely dry? Like, why not just over dry it? What's the disadvantage there too?
Yeah, you can over dry. There actually is no such thing as over freeze drying. So It's not like dehydrating. So like when in doubt, just keep freeze drying. The downside of doing that is that you're using more electricity than you need. But, something can only get 100% dry, and then it just is sitting there.
Right.
It doesn't do anything bad to it at all. So that's kind of gives you a little insurance policy there that you can just keep going if you're not sure. But there are a few things that happen. One, the sensors in the freeze dryer they're not sensing all of every single tray.
Right.
They're in select spots on different trays, and maybe not even every tray, depending on the freeze dryer that you have. And so your machine is pretty much guessing when your food is done, or taking an average of the information that it's gathering for when your food's done. So that can mean that sometimes this, just like in dehydrating, sometimes the stuff in the center tray or the fourth tray down or whatever your particular dehydrator is, isn't as done as all the rest of the trays in there. The other thing that can happen is exactly what you're talking about. Your freeze dryer, if you don't get to it fast enough, will start reducing the temperature in the freeze dryer again on the chances that your food is not actually done, and it wants to keep it in a safe food range. So it's not, gathering bacteria. So it starts dropping that temperature again. So let's say, it ended in the middle of the night. Obviously, you're not going to get to it in the middle of the night because nobody wants freeze-dried tomatoes that badly to wake up at 2 a.m. And so it's just been kind of sitting there in its extra dry mode until you get to it the next morning. And when you get to it, it's back down to 20 degrees, 0 degrees, 50. It can be all over the place on temperature. If you pull that out of the machine right when it's that cold, you instantly get condensation on it, which instantly turns into moisture. And that freeze-dried food is very, very quickly starting to rehydrate. Anytime even a drop of liquid gets into it, it's rehydrating. So one thing you need to always do is make sure you hit that warm tray button that is on your freeze dryer before you remove the trays, even before you remove them to test if they are done. You need to never pull your tray out of the freeze dryer without it being warm, at least room temperature.
Okay, that makes perfect sense now. Yeah. I bet every freeze-dried egg in my house is bad right now. Like I didn't even realize it.
Well, if you're not too humid in your area, you live in a pretty humid area. So if you're humid, then that is going to suck. That condensation is going to be fast and it's going to be a lot. If you live in a really dry area, that may not really be that big of a deal. but it's
Mm-hmm.
still best practice. Just hit that warm tray and then pull it out and then work really quickly to go ahead and package each
Yep.
batch of it. So, but the way you're going to know when you go to open your packages, if it's good or bad, it should still be totally powdery and it should smell fine.
Yeah.
If you have those two things, then you're good to go.
Yeah. With eggs, you can totally follow the smell. I mean, it's so obvious when you have a bad egg. Now, what happens if it's like a little bit bad? I'm just talking from people who might be a little fearful of this. And it smells like almost good. Like, what can happen to you there?
Well, yeah. And we all know, like, even with, fermented food, when you're first getting started, what smells bad versus what smells different than you're used to, right? And there is, especially with something like freeze-dried eggs, there is a smell that you may not be used to because you've got powdered eggs sitting completely closed in a jar. So that first whiff that hits you is like, whoa, that's strong.
Yeah, potent egg.
Potent
smell.
egg. What you're really looking for is that your food is completely powdery to the touch.
Okay.
It should not be gummy. It should not be sticky. It shouldn't be anything besides completely powdery. So you should be able to pick up a fingerful and kind of crumble it, and it should still totally powder in your fingers. If it does that, then it does not have enough moisture in it to be a problem.
Okay.
So then it's completely safe and good to go.
Okay. Yeah. And then you mentioned packaging. I know it's different with most things, or maybe it's mostly just the same. What are your recommendations for packaging different things?
Yeah, so I like to break packaging into 3 different ways of doing it for freeze-dried food. One, you have your like ultra long-term kind of your prepper storage. You're like, you want to put those eggs up for 20 years in case the apocalypse happens, right? You know, it's like, I'm going to be eating eggs no matter what happens. I reserve that for lattes in my house and freeze drying lattes because that's how I feel like if the world goes up in flames, I want to make sure I have a latte to comfort myself.
Wait, what do you do? How do you do that?
We freeze dry lattes.
Now I'm curious. Sorry, we'll come back to this.
We freeze dry lattes. You just make your espresso, pull your espresso. You can do this with coffee. You can do it with tea. You can do it with whatever, but you just make your latte essentially, except that you don't have to steam your milk because you don't actually need it hot. And you pour it on your trays and you freeze dry it. And when Josh travels, he travels with little individual packets of lattes from home because we're kind of partial to our own cow's milk.
Oh, yes. Home is where the good coffee is. I saw that like on a sign somewhere and I'm like, yes, it is. That is right.
That's a good sign. I like that one. So yeah, we do that with all sorts of stuff. So, but if you want to drink your latte during the apocalypse, then you need to put that in long-term storage. And that's going to mean a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber. Okay. So completely blocking light in that Mylar bag.
Okay.
That is really, for most of us who are like trying to preserve our garden produce, that's usually outside of our range of normal, unless you're going backpacking or camping and you want something, or traveling, you want something disposable. That'd be the other time that I would use a Mylar bag. But what I find is that when I have food in a Mylar bag, I don't use it because I can't see it.
Yes, I feel the same way.
I also can't organize it on my shelf. Like anybody try to organize Mylar bags on anything and it's a pain. You pretty much have to throw them into a bin.
Yeah. Yes, you have to throw them in a bin.
So for medium-term storage, which is pretty much like, hey, I'm gardening and I want to make sure I have enough to get through until my next good garden year on this particular item. So, it's really going to be about a year to about 3, maybe even 5 years. I love it because we all know fruit especially has good years and bad years. So it's like, you can put up enough in the good years to get you through the not great years to get around to the good years again. And it'll last really well. And to do that kind of medium-term storage, I go with mason jars with an oxygen absorber in them and then vacuum sealed down. And that is so practical because you can see into them. They fit on your shelf. You probably already have mason jars laying around if you're like us. I should have bought stock many years ago in ball because I still buy them out, or Azure Jar Canning Company or something. But yeah, that's that way to go. The other way that you can package food is if you know you're going to eat it really quickly, as in like within a couple of weeks. So I save this for my snacking foods, which I don't know about your house, but if I lay out freeze-dried food, like fruit, it is gone in probably 30 minutes in my house. So this is a little bit of a moot point in my household, but for most places, especially if you have adults and you can control your snacking a little bit, your food can stay pretty good for about 2 weeks if you keep the hydration, the humidity levels low. And so for that, we go with something that's like a jar, like an old Fido jar that can be opened and closed and has the seal on it.
Yeah.
Or Ball now has these lids that have the little rubber gasket on it that you can just put onto your jars, something like that. And I go with a silica desiccant package in that, not an oxygen absorber. Okay. And that will keep something dry enough that it really stays pretty good quality for at least 2 weeks, depending on the humidity and how often you get into it. So those are the different ways of packaging. And what I really found is when I first started doing the freeze-dried eggs, I was not putting an oxygen absorber in and I was not vacuum sealing my jars. So I was just
I didn't realize how important the vacuum sealing was on the jars.
It really is, especially if you're in a high humidity area. You really, really do need to do that. So, and it's easy to do. Now there's so many options for little handheld vacuum sealers for jars. You don't have to get some fancy vacuum sealer. And even you can even put them back into your freeze dryer and vacuum seal in your freeze dryer. Use your vacuum pump on your freeze dryer to vacuum seal. And I can do 10 jars at a time in my freeze dryer. So that's kind of handy.
Is that all in your book? Because I've never heard of that.
That is in the book. Yes.
Okay.
I do cover that on like a side note somewhere in the book. It's really easy though. You just pull your rack out. It has a little disconnect in the back on the wires. Then you have to like put a tray in there just because it's a round drum. So just a flat surface to sit your jars on. And then you put your jars in, you put bands on for that, but just not too tight.
Okay.
And then you go into your functional setting button, which is the little leaf on a harvest right. Mm-hmm. And using that, you can just flip on the vacuum pump. And you have to lock the drain valve down so that you're not just sucking air right through the whole system. Lock that down and it'll create a vacuum and you just let it run for about 2 minutes and it'll vacuum seal all those jars. So
oh my goodness.
That's a great way if you're doing a bunch of them.
Yeah, that's so easy. And then do you tighten down the bands after that or just...
I take them off.
You could remove them? Okay. Yeah, just remove them. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that. I don't know why I've never heard this. I guess I just never thought about how important the storage was. Because like you said, we live in a very humid environment. And I'm sure oxygen's sneaking in under the, even though I have the jars that have, I'm not using like plastic lids, but even with the gasket, I'm sure plenty of humidity and oxygen still getting in there.
Yeah, it still does. It still works its way in. And then, I think it's where like there's atmospheric changes or temperature changes that really kind of gives a little gap for some transfer of humidity. And that will just really start to ruin those really quickly. Even if it doesn't get moist enough for you to notice it and to have like a safety problem, it starts declining the quality of it really, really quickly.
Okay. Yeah. That's all such good things to know because you have enough failures with something. It makes you like, I don't really want to try it. But really, it was probably something simple that you just needed to tweak that would make it just as successful as it was a failure before.
Right. Exactly. One thing that I've really been loving and getting into lately is as my family, I don't know about you, Lisa. I know you have kids that are kind of comparable age range as my kids. I had this belief, and it is a very mistaken belief, that as the kids got older and could drive, that life would calm down a little bit. And I don't know where I thought that, but it's wrong. It's just
it's so wrong. And every like older mom tells you that when you have toddlers and you're like, whatever. And then you're like, oh, yep, 100%. Like that was the easy days. I feel that because there's times when like we'll divide and conquer and Luke will have the big kids and I'll have the little kids. And I'm like, man, like you have like your little schedule. You put like life feels very predictable, very controlled, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And then you get multiple driving, or now I have children living in the home, like with their first jobs and their first cars and all of that. And it's
I'm
like
not there yet, but yeah.
everybody's going every direction all the time. And so what I've really been experimenting with is single serve, grab and go freeze dried meals.
Oh,
in
okay.
like I like the wide mouth pint jars for that because I feel like they're a really solid serving size. But we are filling the shelves with just the meals that the family would love and then portioning them into single servings and then getting them in these jars, because literally when my daughter runs to the office and she forgot to make her lunch, she can grab one of those and run out. And then at the office, she can just put hot water into it.
Oh, that's such a good
and
idea.
She has a lunch. But I mean, the lunch is then mom's chicken pot pie.
Yeah, it's your good stuff.
Or chicken fajitas, or, it's not the junky stuff that you would get. It's not a cup of noodles from.
Yeah. So are you doing like a bulk day where you make like a massive batch of soup and then are you just kind of like when you have food, you just a little leftover, maybe pour it in, or what's your process for that?
Yeah, we kind of just double up when we have extra ingredients for things, and we'll be like, hey, let's just make a second batch of this tonight. And then, one of the great things about freeze drying is it's ideal to pre-freeze your food in a freezer. And so you can stick those trays right into your freezer until you have enough of them to run a whole batch. Or a whole freeze dryer load. So kind of whenever we have extra, whether it's leftovers or we're able to make a second batch of something, we just start portioning it off onto freeze dryer trays, get it right into the freezer. And then we just run a batch as soon as we have enough trays. And this is really exciting because it's like, where I'm most excited, I think, is thinking about when mom gets sick and nobody quite makes mom the chicken noodle soup that she wants that, everybody else gets when they're sick.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I want it freeze dried on the shelf. So I have my cans of soup ready to go for when I don't feel well. And it's made with my own really good quality bone broth, our own home raised chickens. Like I know that it's really good quality and really nourishing.
All right, taking a quick break from this episode to tell you about my course, Simple Sourdough. So I've been educating on sourdough since 2016 on my YouTube channel and on my blog. More recently, I took those years of resources, recipes, how-to instructions, and put them all into one course so that it's all compiled together. You can get it in one place and learn from the very basics. So if you are brand new and you want to learn how to do sourdough the simple way, or even if you want to improve your baking skills, you should check out my course, Simple Sourdough. It's all for a very affordable price. I wanted to get this information into kitchens all across the world. You can learn more and become a student at bit.ly/simple sourdough course. bit.ly/simple sourdough course, all one word, all lowercase. Now, something like chicken pot pie, how are you reconstituting that?
Reconstituting, I think both in dehydrating and freeze drying, it's such a non-modern process anymore that I think we get very nervous about it and it feels very unintuitive. But what I found there's all these fancy methods out there for rehydrating things. And honestly, just pouring some water over it works 99% of the time. The rule about it is if it is something that is raw, you use cold water. If it's something that is cooked or has been blanched, you use like hot water or liquid. And you don't have to get stuck with just water. You can rehydrate with all different liquids. I mean, you think about if you freeze dry apple pie filling, which is to die for, by the way, it is so good. Ooh. But then you rehydrate it with apple cider instead of water.
Oh, double up on that.
Or, what if you go with a cinnamon tea and you rehydrate it with a cinnamon tea instead? Like you can play with the flavors a lot. Think about rehydrating your steak bites. You can rehydrate it with wine, with bone broth, with, you could come up with a mushroom tea if you wanted to add some more umami flavor to it. Like you could get really creative with it. But in general, I have found that a vast majority of things, you just put a little water on it, wait a few minutes, double check that it's the right consistency that you want, add a little more water if you need it, and then it's fine. So I think it doesn't need to be as scary of a problem. And I even do this with lasagna slices that have been freeze dried and like just add a little water on it and it'll rehydrate great.
Now, what are you storing those in?
The lasagna slices.
The lasagna, like you're doing the soups and stuff, that makes sense
Yeah.
in the mason jar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the lasagna and the chicken pot pie.
Okay. So in general, we have to put those, well, the chicken pot pie, I do the filling, and then I will cook little rounds, like almost little biscuits out of pie dough on the side. And so I will take a jar and I'll fill it with the filling, and then I'll put a little pie dough that's also been freeze dried right on the top.
Oh.
And so then what I do to rehydrate is I pop that little pie dough biscuit off. I rehydrate, I put the biscuit back on, and then it steam rehydrates right on the top of the rest of it. And it turns out, so perfect.
Well, that's simple.
So yeah, it makes it really easy. For something like the lasagna though, we've been saving those in Mylar bags just because of the space issue. But what I just found were little round silicone, like almost like muffin tins, but I think they'll fit perfectly inside the wide mouth pint jars. So we're going to start freeze drying things in that to make this perfect little round puck that I can put on. So I'm wondering if I could even like make little mini lasagnas that will then fit inside the jar. Just like use a little biscuit cutter to make all the layers just right. That's a little fussy. I don't know if I will ever like make that a regular thing, because
like in bulk, but just to see how
it'd be fun.
Experiment. Like you said, this isn't a well-worn path at this point. So much of this you're just kind of coming up with and seeing what
just
works.
Trying it. Yeah. We did to write the book because the second half of the book actually has an complete like encyclopedia of different foods that you might harvest from your garden or your farm, whether we're, talking proteins or milk or, vegetables or fruit. And we tested all the numbers of like exactly what the best way to do everything was, exactly how much you have to purchase or start with in order to fill up certain size trays on your freeze dryer, the exact amount of your rehydration ratios of like, if you want to know exactly, instead of just eyeballing it, kind of like I said to just do. But if you're a measurement person and you're like, okay, I have a cup of corn, how much liquid do you need to add? We have ratios exactly for that in the book.
I bet that was a process.
It was hundreds
like
of batches.
Coming up with all that.
Yes, it was a lot of batches. But it's the numbers that I wanted to know and have in my house, because the other day we ended up having one extra large tray available that didn't have anything on it on an extra large freeze dryer. And we had corn that I knew we were going to have to start processing. So I was like, well, let's just go to the garden and harvest a little corn and fill up one tray. But then, you're instantly doing that math. I know you do this math. That's like, okay, about how much would go in each, whatever it is, each jar, each tray, each whatever. Okay, about how much is on each ear of corn. So therefore, let's guess about this many ears of corn.
Yeah.
And so I was sitting there doing that. And I was like, wait, I just got a copy of my book in. So I flipped over to the corn page, and right there it said, for an extra large tray, start with 20 ears of corn. And so I literally went to the garden, grabbed 20 ears of corn. We shucked those, and it worked out to be an exact measurement. And I was like, oh, this is why I wrote this book. It's really for me, honestly. It's like, these are the numbers that I need to know all the time. So yeah. I can't even remember where we started on that.
I don't even think I thought about, like, when I knew you were writing a freeze drying book, I don't think I thought about what all would go into, like, I realize now what all I'm doing wrong, how this could all be better. I don't think I realized like what went into the skill that went into freeze drying, but I also knew that I haven't made it work that great for my own family. So I think that that's where all the pieces come together. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those things that like you can get away with a little bit kind of doing it half-heartedly, I guess. And that's where I started, was just kind of tossing things in. But you're probably not going to have the results that you see in the marketing of the freeze dry, right? So it's always going to be a little bit of a disappointment, because you're going to be like, I thought it would be better than this. Well, it can be. You just have to actually learn the skill to do it.
Yes, that all makes sense. Okay, one more thing I want to ask you about is your freeze dryer setup, just because I'm really curious. I don't feel like I've ever had my setup as convenient and like set up as I should to make this a regular part of our lives. And I'm just assuming that you probably do.
Yes, although with 3 machines, you do have to get a little opportunistic about where they all live because nobody has a house that was designed with freeze dryers in mind,
True. Yeah.
So you do have to kind of figure out where the space is going to work. There is a noise issue. They are a little noisy. They aren't terrible. I wouldn't say they're worse than an average dishwasher. We have the premium pumps on ours, and those are not too loud. If noise is an issue, do not go with an oilless pump. Those are very loud.
Okay. That's good to know.
So, but you also want them accessible because you do need to check on them and you need to work with them. And you do want them relatively near a freezer if you're freezing food because you don't want to be trying to walk around. They get really cold, those trays, those metal trays. So I find that I have to use oven mitts already. But, if you have 5 trays, 6 trays, 7 trays that can go in your freeze dryer, you don't want to be making that many runs to a freezer that's a long ways away. So you want them kind of close if you can. What you need to know is that freeze dryers are heavy and they vibrate because they're machinery. And so you need them on something heavy duty. You do not want them on a flimsy little cart thing that could collapse because that's a big investment. You don't want injuries too.
Yeah. No.
So, something that's really heavy duty, we ended up with like a commercial kitchen, stainless steel rack that has like a butcher top on it.
Okay.
And I love that because it has a storage shelf underneath it that's stainless steel. So I can have the freeze dryers on the top of it. They're nice and heavy duty. Underneath that on a rack, I can have the pumps and any equipment that I have. And then below that on the ground, you have your location for your drainage bucket, which is where when your food is freeze drying, it sucks out the moisture. Well, that moisture has to go somewhere.
Right.
So it goes out that drain hose and down. You want it to always be below into a bucket, and it just kind of gravity drains to there. And then you can dump that out. And so I've loved that setup with those kind of different tiers.
Are you able to have all 3 of them in the same spot? Or are they kind of, no, I mean that would be a lot. So are they all near your kitchen? Or do you have some like in the basement or the garage?
Yeah, they're all in the basement, but I have a kitchen in the basement. So where I film is in my second kitchen, which is in the basement because, so many props to you because you actually film in your household kitchen. And I'm like, I would cry all the time because so much is happening in there all the time. And there's always somebody working in the kitchen that I just wasn't able to make that work. So this is a kitchen downstairs and I'm able to have the freeze dryers, right? 2 of them right here. Another one's in another room because it's really big. That's the extra large. And, we just didn't have additional space down here.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense though. Like even if you didn't have a kitchen in your basement, but you wanted to do your freeze drying in the basement, if you had some kind of work surface down there, all of your like racks that you're going to put everything on when you're storing, I could totally see how even without a kitchen, you could get the whole setup that you need fairly inexpensively. Like what else would you have to have? You wouldn't necessarily need a sink or, I mean, I guess it'd be nice to be able to like wash your knives and stuff, but you could pretty easily do like a whole setup.
Yeah, you just walk those back to your kitchen or you do, we do all the work in the main kitchen most of the time. We just bring the freeze dryer trays down and stick them in the freeze dryer.
Oh, okay.
So the one thing that's really nice to have if you're going to do a lot of it is a packaging setup, like where you have it. There are stand free funnels they actually have their own stand with an adjustable height and they're large enough to be able to take your whole tray and dump it in. And then it funnels it into a Mylar bag or a half-gallon jar or a quart jar, whatever you want. So having something like that set up with your vacuum sealer, and if you're using Mylar bags, you need an impulse or heat sealer to seal those bags. Yep. That kind of setup is you want near your machine. But aside from that, there's not really a lot of additional equipment that you have to have outside of your regular kitchen stuff that you already have.
I mean, if you're going to be growing as much food as you all are, or if you aspire to be self-sufficient in some way, having that set up to where it's easy, like there's not a huge rub between like the garden and then the preservation is even just a little bit of something like in your way, a little bit of inconvenience makes it to where it's it's just something you don't do. So I think taking those extra steps to really have it set up and ready to go, like even like you said, having that funnel, thinking like, how can I make this more efficient would be really important.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And especially if you're using your freeze dryer like constantly, this season of the year, I know a lot of us are like that. The canners are kind of running constantly. The dehydrators are running constantly. You get to the place where your freeze dryers are just running constantly. And so you're swapping in and out batches. So every step you can make to make it more efficient is time that you've saved in the long run. And it adds up pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, tell us where we can find your book because it launches or is it out now or just pre-order now?
The day that we're filming this, it came out yesterday. It launched.
Okay.
Yesterday.
So yeah, it's way out by the time this comes out. So get your hands on this book. Where do you recommend getting it?
You can get it from homesteadliving.com. You can go over there. I'm sure, Lisa, you can put some links in for them in the description.
There'll be links.
You can also grab it on Amazon or, it should start appearing in all sorts of different places wherever you buy your books. And if you have a bookseller that you love that isn't carrying it, please request it and ask them to look it up and start selling it. But it is out and it is available. And if you freeze dry or if you're dreaming about freeze drying, it is definitely the book you're gonna want to get on your shelf just for your everyday reference and for learning all the steps that you need to know.
I mean, I'm fully sold. I need this book here in our house for sure. Awesome, Carolyn. Well, thank you so much. And we're just so glad you're back on. I know I'm going to be on yours talking about sourdough. So make sure to check out the pantry chat over on Homesteading Family as well. Great podcast over there. Again, thanks so much, Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. It's great hanging out with you.
Right. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode of the Simple Farmhouse Life podcast.